Hello again. I'm Eric with Smart Pot Fabric Planners, back with another great episode of the Growing Revolution Smart Potcast. And the topic that I wanted to cover today was fertilizer labeling laws, misconceptions, and myths. And who better to help us understand this topic than Dr. Earth himself, Milo Shammas. Milo, welcome back to the podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for making time. So my first question is, what ratio of NPK is best for the average veggie grower out there? And, what numbers should we look for in either a liquid fertilizer or a dry granular fertilizer?
Yeah, that's a great question, Eric. And I think it's much more relevant when we look at synthetic products and that takes us to a whole different discussion. But when you're dealing with synthetic fertilizers and NPK, typically earlier in the season, you'd want to have a higher N number to stimulate the vegetative growth and a lower nitrogen number and more of a phosphorus number, more of the P number, the middle number, when you get into the flowering or the budding stage of a plant. And that's true whether you're growing tomatoes, fruit trees, or anything else, cannabis, anything you're growing. They're going to require, plants are plants, Eric. And when they're in a vegetative state, vegetation state, I should say, they want more nitrogen to stimulate the green growth. And when the lights, dim, literally and metaphorically, when you go into the summer solstice, and then the daylight hours minimize or lessen, I should say, you want a lot less nitrogen. But the way to do that is to kind of taper into it. I mean, it's not like it is a magic day where, obviously there's more daylight than dark. That is a factual number. But in nature, you kind of taper up to that and, taper down from it. And so I don't like to see people go by the calendar and say, well, the plant's in a vegetative, growth pattern right now, and I should feed it heavy nitrogen. But on the 22nd, when we go through the solstice, I'm going to eliminate that altogether, and I'm going to go pure phosphorus. And the reason why I bring that up is because in nature, it doesn't quite work like that. I mean, the leaves falling, that happens for a reason, because that, as those leaves decompose in the soil, they're going to release that nitrogen naturally. So you kind of want to mimic what's happening in the environment you live in. So if you're gardening in Hawaii, it's really different than if you're gardening in Michigan. You're, just because you have a hard day and daylight hours lessen, factual number, it doesn't mean you should behave like the guy that's gardening in Hawaii, because he doesn't have that same complexity of daylight hours and NPK importance. He can really taper throughout the whole season. Now, let's talk about the guy growing in Michigan, where it really does matter because it's going to get colder, and you do see a drastic response from plants because obviously it's not just the daylight hours, but it's also the temperatures. And plants are going to respond to two things. They're going to respond to the hours, and they're going to respond to the temperatures, and they're going to respond to both simultaneously. So if you do live in Michigan, hypothetically, I'm going to use that because that's the extreme that we tend to look at in Northern America. But if you do live there, I mean, you should start using, let's say hypothetically, early in the season, my Michigan friends, frost is broken. They've just transplanted the rows. Well, they're going to want to focus on two things. Little, phosphorus, because roots need the phosphorus, and a lot more nitrogen to really stimulate that vegetative growth and to get it out of, its dormancy. But as we head into that summer solstice and we're heading into those lower daylight hours, we don't want to give it the same exact amount of nitrogen from the time it breaks dormancy until we hit, fall. It's just not natural. So what you'd want to do is you kind of look around and say, well, it's getting cooler. Yes, I know the daylight hours they haven't lowered yet, but it's getting cooler and I can feel fall coming on. If you can feel it, so can your plants, and you need to respond accordingly because your plants will. Now, plants don't typically respond overnight. Plants usually take 2 to 3 weeks to kind of, biologically just, understand what's happening to them. And that's why I say temperature is the other really critical element in this whole equation when you look at NPK. And just keep your eyes on that. I mean, if then you'd want to definitely cut back on the nitrogen because they're not going to need it nearly as much. But plants are always going to need nitrogen because it's required for photosynthesis, tissue building. It's really an important element. It's a macro nutrient. So you can't just say, well, all I want to do is give it phosphorus and potassium and calcium. I mean, the majority probably, but that doesn't mean nitrogen just goes away. But what that would mean is, let's say, as you're heading into that, summer solstice and the daylight hours are going to lower, you may want to go into a triple, like an all-purpose product as you transition before you get into like a budding or a blooming or a flowering product. And there's an array of them. And let's use 555, for example, as like a baseline. We make both the 555 and our all-purpose fertilizers of 444, equal parts NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Now, we were talking about a vegetable gardener. When I would recommend something dry or liquid to our gardeners, I would recommend our vegetable fertilizer product. And that would tend to have a higher number earlier in the season. Now, as we're heading into that summer solstice and we're going to taper into flowering, you'd want to use the vegetable fertilizer. But even though it's a vegetable, you're going to want to start to cater to something more with a higher phosphorus, as we discussed, more of a flowering and a blooming fertilizer. But in between time, you'd want to probably go towards an all-purpose, a 444, for example. And that being said, is that they're going to still get the nitrogen they need. They're going to have enough phosphorus to help them taper into that time period. And obviously potassium is the all around, just for strength and, just cell construction and everything else. It's just, really a primary macronutrient that is hard to overdo. And then use something like that. And then as you're a month into the solstice and clearly leaves are dropping all around with the exception of maybe your, whatever plant you're focusing on, they're going into flower, like your tomatoes all of a sudden. They're going from a green color to a reddish color. And yes, they're gonna definitely benefit more from phosphorus because you will for flavor and ripeness and all these sorts of things that we admire and we aspire to achieve as a gardener. And less nitrogen. I mean, leaves are not nearly as important to us later in the year because they've done their job for us. I mean, the leaf is really is a photosynthesis factory, if you think about it. So why do we want to give it a lot of nitrogen early in the season? We want the leaves big and we want their ability to convert that nitrogen as a protein, as a tissue builder, so that it can help to build bigger and better buds and blooms and ultimately fruits and vegetables. And the way you would do that is you need bigger green leaves early in the season, thus the more nitrogen early on. But then later in the season, as the fruit and vegetables are already set in place, and you don't need nearly as much nitrogen. So you don't need to feed the green part of the plant, the foliage. You've done your job already. It's produced the buds and the blooms and the fruits and flowers it can produce. There's nothing you can do magically in the second part of the year, regardless of what fertilizer you're using. I'd love to tell you that Dr. Earth can, magically, at the second half of the year, if you use our bud and bloom booster, for example, that's an extreme phosphorus product. Materialize thousands more, buds and blooms and flowers. It just doesn't work like that. If the plant itself hasn't developed those buds and those fruits and vegetables early on, it's not going to do it on the second part of the year. What could happen is what's existing could potentially take on a much larger size, flavor, robustness, and a health variable. And that's why, yes, the numbers do matter. Much more so if you're a synthetic chemical user, because you really do have to watch the numbers so carefully. And if you use the numbers inaccurately, depending on the environment you live in, if you live in San Diego, totally different thing. The environment's going to be much more forgiving than if you lived in upstate New York. You really have to watch the math and the numbers much more carefully, or especially where you live in Florida. I mean, you guys are a year-round gardening state, but you still have your solstice. I mean, the sunlight hours are going to lessen no matter what. And tomato plants, even indeterminate varieties, are eventually going to say, hey, you know what? It's kind of time to put out these fruits and vegetables. It's their own survival mechanism. I mean, fruits and vegetables are there for a reason. It's to produce more seeds in that fruit and vegetable so that the plant can sustain itself and keep going on for future generations. So, but if you're an organic gardener, You live by a different mantra. You live by a different style because you're not really feeding the plant an NPK. You become much more the person that feeds the soil.
Right.
Whether it's more protein, which would really, break down to a nitrogen later in the year. And, what does that mean? Well, proteinaceous materials, let's say fish meal. Fish is a pure protein. But ultimately, as it's decomposed by soil microbes, it's going to be converted to 100% nitrogen. Makes sense. So you'd want to give the plant or the soil proteins early in the season, and then you'd probably want to give them less protein and more of your bone material in the latter part of the season. And that breaks down to phosphorus and calcium, which is what the P part of the synthetic product is really trying to mimic. So if you're an organic gardener using Dr. Earth or any other product, you don't need to know nearly as much. I mean, you can kind of toss out the chemistry lesson because you don't need it. The plant takes care of itself simply because you have a healthy soil that knows how to break the nutrients down as the plant roots need them. And the really cool thing about being an organic gardener and having a great living soil and, something that's really rich in probiotics, everything I've been touting for the last 30 plus years, is that the microbes that are breaking the organic materials down in the soil, they tend to do exactly what the plant is doing because the microbes are also temperature sensitive. So they're going to be much more active and they're going to break down a lot more material, whether a protein or a bone material early in the season. As temperature warms, they're more active. They're multiplying more. They're breaking down more materials. So therefore, they're making more nutrients available, bioavailable for the plant roots to absorb. As the temperature drops, not only does your plant know that, hey, I don't need quite as much nutrition at this point, especially the nitrogen, but guess what happens? Microbes also slow down and they break down less nutrients. So therefore, you end up with a nutrient reserve in the soil. And you don't have to be a chemist or a microbiologist to understand that because the microbes do the understanding for you. And that's the really neat thing. And a big part of being a chemical gardener or a gardener that uses synthetic NPKs versus an organic gardener who doesn't really get the NPK right quite often. And it's okay. It's really fine. I mean, if you did nothing but use a 444 year round, you would have great results because the microbes would break down the nitrogen when it's needed, the phosphorus as it's needed, and potassium is always broken down, which is always needed. And keep another thing in mind too, Eric. There is no such thing in nature as triple 20. It just doesn't exist. I mean, I know people call me all the time, hey, compare your products with this triple 20 that I have, or a triple 30, or a 35-10. And then the first answer is I have is that, well, these things just don't exist in nature. There's no such thing as 30% nitrogen in nature. It doesn't exist. You'd have a flammable globe. I mean, the whole world would be combustible. So you don't have that problem. And the other part of it is the majority of that 30% nitrogen isn't absorbed by plant roots. So what happens to water-soluble nitrogen? It's going to end up in the waterways. It's going to end up polluting the rivers, the streams, and ultimately our oceans. And so if people want to be good stewards, not just to their garden and the safety of their home and children and pets, but if they want to be good stewards to the environment, using unnatural numbers will usually lead to unnatural consequences, which is usually a surplus of these nutrients intended to do good things, but the net result more than often tends to be a negative result. So, NPK is important. And if somebody wants to use synthetic NPKs, that's great. Try to go for the lowest numbers that you can because you're probably going to, get your money's worth. That's number one. If you're paying for 30% nitrogen, and we've done extensive studies on this. I mean, years ago, it's been a long time since I've had to prove, a chemical versus an organic. This was like, that was like a big challenge for me, as you can imagine, when I first launched the company, because that's all people were focusing on. Well, hold on a second. The numbers are really low here. When the numbers here are triple 30, I'm getting more my money's worth. Boy, that makes, kind of seems like a common sense question. But if you think about it, there is no way in the world, if you apply 30% nitrogen or even 100% nitrogen, that your plants are going to absorb anywhere near that amount of nitrogen. And the amount that we found in a water-soluble product, the most that they can absorb on a perfectly hot and warm day where the plants on their own are seeking that nitrogen to build more green foliage is around 5%. And that's even in slower moving soils. Now, if you have really porous soils, which you should have, fast draining soils, I mean, you can get into like the 1 or 2% nitrogen. So what happened to the other 28%? You just spent a lot of money for 30%. You may have gotten 1 to 2, 5% at best, let's say. And then the rest becomes an environmental hazard for you, your family, and for the globe. So, I mean, for that reason, I say the numbers are important. More so if you're a synthetic gardener than if you're an organic gardener.
Yeah. I just love your answer there. There's so much good information in that answer there.
Thank you.
And I totally agree. Now, besides nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, what would be the next 2 or 3 most important elements for optimal plant health?
Calcium is a big one because that tends to give the cells the strength that they need. It also really participates in phosphorus absorption and cell division. It's a really important element. It also helps to prevent a lot of the fungal diseases like blossom end rot. You'd really want to make sure you have ample amounts of calcium. Sulfur is always a very needed ingredient, and magnesium. These tend to be, the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and those other 3 tend to be the big macros that you can buy. Besides, what's free in the air with water and oxygen. Those are the 3 that you'd really need: hydrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen, oxygen, carbon. That was so easy. It seemed hard. But yeah.
Yeah. I think calcium almost should be like the 4th number on NPK because I have very very soft water where I'm at with almost no calcium, and I have to add a lot of calcium, otherwise I see tons of blossom end rot on my tomatoes. So I'm all for that.
Yeah. Also I think most gardeners tend to forget about the pH. And pH is one of the most critical things that we gardeners really need to pay attention to. And the reason being is that you may have a plethora of nutrients already existing in the soil, but the pH will determine their solubility. So if the pH isn't within that, that optimal range we all talk about, which is, between 6 and 7, I always tell people if you can have just keep your garden at about 6.4 to 6.7 a pH, most nutrients will be bioavailable and you'll get everything that's, available in the soil to your plants. So watch the pH, and that can be really, that can be had very easily with an inexpensive pH meter at your local garden center. Just spend $10, but that $10 can save you nights of headaches of why aren't my plants growing? I've done everything. I'm watering it. It's in the sun. I'm giving it all the fertilizers I thought I'm supposed to. And the fertilizers are probably there, but they're probably locked up in an insoluble form. So watch the pH, because a lot of times you do have, especially phosphorus. Phosphorus is a very ubiquitous and abundant nutrient. If the pH isn't right, it's going to be locked up. Either way, if the pH is too low or too high, phosphorus just gets locked up in an iron phosphate and just all kinds of different forms. It gets compounded very easily. But at a pH of 7.2, phosphoric acid, the way you would see it on the label, P2O5, gets converted to PO4, which is orthophosphate. And orthophosphate means, it's from the Latin orthos, which means straight phosphate. And that's the most desirable source of phosphorus you want to give your plants. And orthophosphate is most soluble at pH 7.2. So you could start out with a soil medium that's slightly more acidic. But when you get into that blooming stage, you'd want to make your soil just slightly more alkali. And I don't mean alkali, but slightly more than your acidic stage later in the season during your time of blossom, to make sure that the phosphorus is available, because that's what you really need to build those blooms and buds and flowers and fruits and vegetables and all the things that give you size and taste and flavor and abundance and prevent all of these fungal and pathogen diseases.
Nice. Now, I have a question kind of relating to your products, because the Dr. Earth products are beyond organic, is it more difficult to have consistency in NPK numbers because your inputs can vary slightly from batch to batch, or is it pretty consistent?
Well, we by law we have to be consistent. So what happens is, when we source materials, and I mean standalone. Let's use fish meal for example. When we source fish meal, we have to run that through the laboratory before we can blend it and make a blend of any sorts, and make sure it has a certain nitrogen level because the time of year you catch the fish will determine the amount of protein, what the protein level is going to be. As you can imagine, there's times of year when the fish has been eating a lot of food and has a lot of fat reserve in it, which means that the nitrogen content is going to go down. Or the leaner years where it's just pure tissue, the nitrogen content will go up. So you really pay attention to that. But yeah, that's a great question. It will most definitely vary. But before we blend anything and we take it for face value of whatever the fishing supply houses give us, we have to test everything, and we will make adjustments before we make a blend. And you're right, it does vary. Nitrogen in fish meal will vary between 8 to 12%, and that's a big spread. It's a huge spread. So we have to keep our eyes on it. We have to make sure it hits a certain percentage, because if we have to add more during whatever blended product we're making, we'll make that adjustment just pre-blend. So it really does vary, absolutely. And I don't think many people understand that they'll just think that, well, fish meal is fish meal is fish meal. That's not true. Fish meal is always fish meal. Well, I suppose it is always fish meal, but it's going to have a different nitrogen element depending on the time of year that it was caught. So it does vary and it does matter.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So what are some ingredients that you've seen, excuse me, in synthetic fertilizers that people should probably look to avoid?
Oh gosh, Eric. I mean, I'm almost the wrong person to ask, because my answer is going to be all synthetics are probably something to stay away from it. And in my garden, there's so many of them. And I just think it comes down to, and the key difference is the synthetic materials. They really feed the plant directly, and the byproducts just end up as pollutants in the soil. So I would personally, I think none of them are needed. I would much rather find my NPK and macro and trace elements from decomposing leaves, as opposed to buying a synthetic product of any sort. So I would just simply say, I think they're not for me. Let's just put it that way. I have nothing negative to say about I understand people have to make products and do what they have to do, but just for me, personally speaking, I wouldn't use any of them. But that's a personal answer.
That's a very Dr. Earth answer, and I wouldn't expect anything else from you. I love it. So would you say that the states are doing a good job of monitoring the contents of fertilizers? And if there was anything that you would like to see the states do differently, what would that be, if anything?
What I've always dreamt of is there would be a national law put in place, like a United States Department of Agriculture, to regulate fertilizer labels, like food labels are regulated, like beverage labels are regulated, like drug labels are regulated. When it comes to fertilizers, I have to deal with 50 different states. And you can imagine I've invented, over 500 products in my career, and 300 of them are currently registered, not in every single state. But in California, I've got over 150 products registered here. And it's hard because I have to meet the requirements here. Then you go right next door to Nevada and the laws completely change. And then by the time we're on the East Coast, the laws have completely changed. And so you have these nuances with different departments of agriculture. Some states are very relaxed as long as you pay your bill and you tell them, what's in the label, and it's accurately in the label because, I'm sure they do their own independent testing. It's fine. But, that's what I've always dreamt of, was like having one unified regulatory body that would force us all to comply to the same sets of rules and regulations. In terms of like, what are the states doing that I'd like to see them change? There's some ingredients, I think, and it's not just so much the states, but I even think like, certified organic agencies. I think they let a lot of things go that are questionable. I'm not going to name ingredients. I know people have to make a living out there, but there's just certain things I don't think have a place in the world of organics. I think when you deal with organics, I don't think it's always the ingredients. I think there's the humane element. I think, people have to look at, well, how is that ingredient sourced? Did an animal have to suffer in order for me to get this ingredient? And I think that has a huge place in organics. And I think you'll notice that most organic consumers tend to be acutely aware of where their ingredients are coming from. And so that's one thing I think I'd like to see the states take a look at, although that's probably not going to happen because these byproducts have to go someplace, and the states have to allow these growers of different foods to let their byproducts go someplace as opposed to taking it to the landfill. And that I agree with, because I don't think, we take these waste materials and we should throw them away or put them in landfills. I think that's wrong too. But then to allow companies to sell certified organic products that I think may have questionable sources or may have come from a questionable source, and then allow these manufacturers to take waste materials and sometimes toxic waste materials, and then the third-party agencies allow them to certify it as organic, and then sell it to consumers that don't know the difference like you and I do. I live in this world. All I do is I study ingredients and labels and fertilizers and soils, and that's my world. That's what I do 7 days a week, from morning till night. It's all I think about. It's who I am. It's my entire talos in life is understanding these things and bringing them to the marketplace. But I think there's a lot of people that take advantage of, not foolish consumers, but naive consumers that don't have the time and energy. They just, who should? I trust cars because I trust the brand, but should I know how a starter works? It's not my job to know where the ignition point is or what the capacity to keep extending. It's not my job. I just know that I trust a brand. I know the car works. It's a safe vehicle. And really, that's all I should know as a consumer. Now, of course, there's guys that love cars, and they love to study that, and they read every label, and they can tell you every different manufacturer, every part, what it does. I can't. I'm not interested in that. I think the same exact thing happens with gardeners. I think there's people like you and I that have, immersed themselves in the category, and we do know better, and we do know where things come from, and we do know what the net result is. And I think states, have an obligation to do a certain amount of research and help, to us consumers. And I think that's where it gets to be dicey and iffy. And I think they should police labels a little more aggressively with more scrutiny. And, and I think what those ingredients are, I think most people know what they are. I'm not going to sit here and, throw different manufacturers under the bus and say what they're doing is bad. I just think the law exists. I think there's a lot of manufacturers taking advantage of the law, taking advantage of naive and ignorant consumers, and they're throwing certified organic on the label, and they're charging them a premium. They're charging them a fortune for these ingredients that they're probably buying for a penny or two a pound, and they're able to sell it for $1 a pound. And you can imagine that kind of a delta. And that's where I think it's unfair. And I think that's where the states should really have more input and crack down on those manufacturers.
Yeah, it is interesting that, we have kind of an FDA, approved label for food products that is standardized, across the industry. But yet, for fertilizers, it's up to each state. So I'm kind of with you. I would like to see a national standard for labeling. It makes sense. So what the plants take out, we need to put back into the soil. What would you recommend from the Dr. Earth lineup to the average smart pot grower who's into, tomatoes, cucumbers, herbs to recharge your soil? You kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, but, is there, I guess if there was like one product, that you would recommend, would it be something like, a 444 that kind of, works with all plants kind of during all phases of the season?
That's the easiest way to go. I think if you apply a 444, I think you've pretty much covered everything. Because in all of our products, it's not just the NPK, even though we don't claim it. I mean, all of our products are very rich in calcium. I mean, this is like something that just because we claim it in our tomato and vegetable fertilizer, I've noticed on a lot of the different blogs and a lot of the different social platforms that grower will say, "Hey, use their homegrown fertilizer. It contains calcium." But really, if you think about it, the calcium is coming from the fish bone meal that we're using. Even though I don't claim calcium on an all-purpose fertilizer or a starter fertilizer or a fruit tree fertilizer, the nutrients are coming from the same source. I'm not taking extra calcium in my homegrown product and sprinkling it in there. The calcium is inherent to the raw ingredient, which is the fish bone meal, the phosphorus and the calcium. So we don't claim it, but it's there. So, really when you look at what product, I suppose if you narrowed it down to just one product, if that's all you had access to, then sure, I would use an all-purpose product to replenish the soil because it's going to give you everything you're looking for. But then I'd be careful with that thinking because let's just say hypothetically, if you've grown your garden and now the soil is fallow and you've depleted all the nutrients in it, but you want to rebuild that soil for, the next crop. Unless you're going to plant in it right away, I would probably use more of a bud and bloom booster. And you're thinking, well, hold on a second, that's contradictory. Hold on, we just harvested everything. Shouldn't we be putting more nitrogen in it? If you're planting right away, yes. Now, why wouldn't I if I was just allowing the soil to sit fallow? It's because nitrogen is the most volatile ingredient. And if it's going to be digested and broken down and a plant is going to absorb it, it's going to wash through the soil. So if you're planting right away, use something with nitrogen in it. If you're not, and you just want to rebuild the soil for its macro and micronutrients, then I would go with something that has more phosphorus in it and less nitrogen. And if you're a rose and flower grower, use the rose and flower product. If you're a fruit tree grower, use the fruit tree product for that reason. But if you're planting right away, then it's totally fine because of that one element. And remember, it's still coming from, you may think, well, Milo, it's still coming from protein. It's still coming from tissue. That's true. But eventually, when that tissue is digested by soil microbes, that nitrogen is going to become soluble in the soil. And whether you're watering that soil or not, it's going to rain. And eventually that nitrogen is going to travel through the soil profile. Even in a smart pot, eventually it's going to wash through the bottom. You guys design your pots for a reason. They drain because they're supposed to drain. Otherwise, you've got pathogens that are going to destroy everything. And especially your pots because they're breathable pots. So you've got extra biological activity than you do in plastic containers or redwood containers or porcelain containers. You've got this porosity happening 365 degrees around the plant, top, bottom, and the sides. So you typically, in your containers, would tend to have much more biological activity. So if you're applying something with more nitrogen and you don't plan on gardening right away, that protein is going to break down into that nitrogen, and that nitrogen will be soluble. And if you're not planting, you're going to lose the nitrogen, which means that when you do put a plant in next year, if you're not planting right away, you've probably lost a good part of the nitrogen. But the phosphorus and calcium will still be there for you. And then you may have an imbalance because you may come back in and put the same exact ingredient. Now you'll have an excessive amount of phosphorus and calcium. Whereas if you didn't do anything at all and waited to re-amend the soil for a later period with nitrogen because the plant will use it. Now, again, if you do want to just build the soil and allow the biology and the chemistry and everything else to happen in the soil while you're waiting to plant, whether it could be a month or 6 months, use less nitrogen, use more phosphorus. And we make a host of products depending on the category you're growing. And if you're a cannabis grower, you probably want to gravitate towards our flower grow, our bud and bloom booster. If you're even if you're a rose grower, you can use our rose product, a rose and flower product, because it has a higher a higher P number, a higher phosphorus number. But vegetable gardening, same exact thing. Let's say you've harvested the entire vegetable garden, and the NPK tends to be higher in phosphorus anyways. You can use that because that nitrogen element will wash away a good part of it. There's a small caveat to that. Depending on the time of year you've added the organic fertilizer with nitrogen in it. Remember what I said earlier was the microbes will respond to the to the air temperature and the soil temperature more specifically. Now, as it cools down, if you've added a proteinaceous material, let's say like pure fish meal, would it just sit there? In theory, a good part of it will, even if it's raining. The reason being is that if you put like a flake, a fish bone flake, or a fish flake in the soil, if the temperature is too cold, the fish flake will just become a physical part of the soil makeup. It's not going to act as a fertilizer element until the environmental conditions permit, which means more biological activity. So if you can imagine this being like a little flake of fish meal, and you have an abundance of microbes around it, as temperature cools, it doesn't matter how many microbes you have around it. If they're all dormant or in stasis or they're not active, that fish particle will just sit there until the environmental conditions permit again, which means that they break dormancy. That typically happens at 54 degrees soil temperature, most active at 81 to 84 degrees soil temperature, and break the material down and provide it for the plants to absorb. The nice thing is you're typically gardening and your roots are typically active exactly when the microbial activity is happening. So if you added an organic product to the soil the wrong time of year, there is no wrong time, but the wrong time of year for the plant, it doesn't wash away like a synthetic product. It doesn't matter. It's going to wash away whether you put it in winter or whether you put it in the middle of summer. Whether there's a plant there or not, all of it's going to wash away. So, there's a lot of environmental reasons to be an organic gardener, not just getting your money's worth and making sure your plants get the maximum benefit of your efforts, but because it's going to wash away and it's not going to be there, and it's going to typically pollute the waterways and the environment.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Now, switching gears, kind of getting into pest and disease control. What ingredients on those products should organic gardeners be looking for versus like what would be in a chemical, pest and disease control product?
That's a great question. I was one of the first, maybe the very first, that had a complete line of certified organic insecticides. And most people don't know Dr. Earth for that, but I invented a line of insecticides in 1996 and brought them to market in 1998 that were essential oil based. We used 5 different essential oils, just a variety of them: mint, peppermint, clove, rosemary, thyme, and we put them through a micronizer to blend them together, so they are really soluble and they're very effective. But what I also do is I was the first one to use garlic oil and compound them with certified organic essential oils. So we're the only ones that use garlic and essential oils certified and have a complete national program. And you can find all of our products at most nurseries nationwide, besides the big box stores. They're available at all the great independent nurseries as well. And the way they work is they suffocate the insects, but so does a vegetable oil. But you wouldn't want to take a vegetable oil and spray your garden with it. They also work by killing the neurotransmitters inside of an insect's brain. So, the way insects work is they have neurotransmitters, and the part that is supposed to receive it is called the neuroreceptor. So what happens is that electron that's being fired off by their brain gets corrupted. Just imagine like having a bad computer. The essential oils corrupt the signal from their brain to their feet or to their wings or to their legs, more specifically to their stomach. So what happens is, even though they're eating something, the signal that tells them, digest it, chew it, it's corrupted. So they keep eating, and eventually they'll just die in a couple of days. Now, what I like to do is, instead of killing the insect, I like to control them. And that's why our insecticides are highly superior, because of the garlic extract. And the garlic that we use it doesn't smell like garlic. It's an invisible smell. But what it does is it fools the insects. And that's more important to me than killing them, because if they land on a plant, they may visually see, oh, there's a tomato plant. It's my host. I'm going to attack it. It lands on it. But when it lands on it, everything's telling it, hold on a second, I'm on a tomato plant. Why don't I want to eat this? Because it's giving off the odor of garlic. And garlic is not a host plant. In fact, I'm not sure if you've ever looked at a garlic plant. No one uses insecticides when growing garlic plants. Or like rosemary plants or sage plants. They don't usually have a whole lot of, insects that attack them. So if we can cover the garden with these beautiful essential oils that are micronized with a compound or compounded micronized with garlic oils, the plant smells totally different. So when an insect lands on them or crawls on them, they think, oh, wrong plant, got to keep going on. And most of the time, they'll just end up flying to your neighbor's garden or to another plant that may not need an insecticide or just crawl away. And if you can control them, you've mastered the art of organic gardening. That is true Zen. Making sure they never attack in the first place. People that garden synthetically always have a problem. And that's when they end up at the nursery and they say, I have a problem. What is it? The entire garden's been just being destroyed by insects. Well, the ecosystem was off. There was an imbalance in the ecosystem. And that usually starts with the soil. The plant is giving off the wrong signals like, hey, I'm distressed, I'm sick, I'm an easy target. So it definitely starts in the soil. And if you're an organic gardener, you'll notice that most organic gardeners have a lot less insect problems because the cell wall, the cellulose and the lignin part of the cell tends to be much thicker because the cell itself developed much more slowly. So it has more time to build these compounds, the cellulose and the lignin compounds. So the plant cell wall itself is much thicker. So just imagine this analogy. What would you rather eat? You can eat both. Would you rather eat a head of butter lettuce, or would you rather eat the side of a tree, bark? They both contain, but that's exactly what it's like for the insects. They're going to want to go for that soft, tender tissue, and most of the time, that soft, tender tissue is brought on by synthetic fertilizers. Why? Because it stimulates them artificially. So you have these multiple cells, very fast-growing cells, with very thin walls. So an insect will look and say, oh, there's a buffet, there's a feast waiting there for me. And it will attack it because it's a really soft meal for it. And that's why you'll notice, like in the grape regions, the first thing that they're going to attack is going to be that tender growth. They've been artificially stimulated. The buds are breaking. Roses are notorious for this. A lot of rosarians, when they break their dormancy, will give it a ton of nitrogen to get those shoots to grow. But at the same time, they've invited all the insects because everything's tender and soft and really just smooth and delicate. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're an organic gardener, you tend to have thicker cell walls, which is more like bark. So insects, very rarely will you see them attacking a bark, the side of a tree. They're going to want to attack the tender growth growing on that tree, right? Same tree. Totally. The insect is there. Why aren't they attacking the bark? Well, that's the older woody part. That's the part that took years to build, as opposed to the tender green part of the tree. It's the same exact thing in your vegetable garden. Same exact thing, except the vegetable garden doesn't have the luxury of giving you a 30-year tuss steady. You're usually growing the vegetable garden, and you're getting to see the results within 3 to 6 months, depending on whatever vegetable or fruit tree you're growing. So if you're an organic grower, you'll tend to have less of those problems. But let's just say you do have those problems. The way to deal with that with an organic insecticide, such as our final stop insect killers, is we fool them. We deceive them, and that's really what I like to call it. We deceive them. We fool them into thinking it's a totally different plant. So when it lands on your tomato plant, and you've used our product, it smells like garlic. It smells like rosemary. And it just totally deceives it and it thinks, I'm on the wrong plant, I need to leave. And you'll never have an attack in the first place. And if you can master that, that's when you've really reached that highest level of organic gardening.
Yeah, totally. I love the saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And, if you're just a really solid organic gardener, those bugs are not going to view those strong growth plants as an easy target. And if you do happen to have issues, I definitely like to lean towards essential oils. Like you said, it, kills, but then I didn't know about the garlic ingredient in there. And somebody told me once that spicy plants like onions and garlic are good for keeping snakes out of your yard because they don't like that smell, and it just makes sense that other creatures like insects wouldn't like spicy substances either. So awesome. I always learn something new when I'm talking to Dr. Earth, so
Thank you.
I just love this conversation. So if people want to hear more about, your products and just your philosophy in general, definitely check out Dr. Earth's YouTube content. Their website is just drearth.com, correct?
Yes, just
Yeah.
Dr. Earth.
So much good information that Milo's been churning out over the decades. And again, we really appreciate him being a steward of the industry overall. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Eric. Keep up the good work, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.